This is the second session of the Conference on Starvation as a Political Tool from the 19th to the 21st century. We have moved chronologically from the Irish famine to the Armenian genocide, and now we will be dealing with the Ukrainian Holodomor and genocide by attrition in the Nuba Mountains of Sudan. The conference is organized by the Holodomor Research and Educational Consortium of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, University of Alberta. This consortium was founded 3 years ago by a grant from the Temerté Family Foundation to carry on both research and educational work on the Holodomor. That is, it has two major interests. One of them is for new research and dissemination of research. The other is for education, and particularly for preparation of curriculum materials on the Holodomor, so that it may be taught in genocide and history courses in primary and secondary schools. We are pleased that we are joined in sponsoring this conference by the International Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, which is a division of the Zorian Institute, the Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies, the Petro Yatsik Program at the Center for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies of the Monk School, and the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures of the University of Toronto. There are materials on the two institutes and some of their publications in the back, some information as well as books that you may purchase. And I would like to point out that there are two events coming up that may be of interest to you. On October the 29th at the Monk Center, there will be an all-day workshop on German policy towards Ukraine and Russia, both in the historical experience and dealing with the current conflict. And then on November the 4th, there will be the annual Holodomor or Ukrainian Famine Lecture. The Ukrainian Congress Committee of Toronto joins us in organizing that event, as well as many of the other institutions. Our lecturer this year is Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University. He will be speaking about the Holodomor in a world context. And if you are interested in those two events, please register immediately, because they will fill up, and at a certain point you will not be able to register for them. And with that, I would like to turn over today's proceedings to Dr. Bogdan Klid.
Thank you, Dr. Sisson. I'm Bogdan Klid from the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. And this afternoon, we have two speakers and a discussant that I'd like to introduce right now briefly. The first speaker will be Andrea Graziosi, who will be speaking on Stalin and starvation as a tool to tame the Ukrainian peasantry. And second speaker, Samuel Totten, genocide by attrition in the Nuba Mountains, Sudan, from malnutrition to severe malnutrition to starvation. And the discussant is Joyce Apsel from New York University, who's putting in a second shift this afternoon. Andrea Graziosi is a professor of contemporary history at the University of Naples, and he's author of books on Soviet history. And in the case of the famine, he's the author of a seminal article, which was a interpretive article on the Holodomor and the Soviet famines of 1931-33. Is a new interpretation possible, and what would its consequences be? He's also the author of an interesting study, The Great Soviet Peasant War, the Bolsheviks and the Peasants, 1918 to 1934, that puts the Holodomor in the context of the general Soviet government and parties' attitudes and policies towards the peasantry as a whole. And Samuel Totten is a professor emeritus at University of Arkansas and has taught there till 2012, has been a Fulbright Scholar at the Center for Conflict Management at the National University of Rwanda, and has been was involved and has been involved from 2004 in investigating atrocities, interviewing refugees from Darfur located in the camps along the Chad-Sudan border, and his current research is focused on the genocide in Darfur and the Nuba Mountains. And he's also served as one of the co-founding editors of Genocide Studies and Prevention, and has edited and co-edited books on genocide. And Joyce Apsel was introduced earlier, but I'll just, I guess, emphasize that she, in addition to her publications on genocide, she's a master teacher of humanities in the liberal studies program of the College of Arts and Sciences at New York University, where she teaches a series of seminars on genocide and human rights, and has focused quite a bit of her attention on teaching human rights and genocide and mass atrocities. So with that, I'll ask the first speaker, Dr. Graziosi, to the microphone.
So thank you for coming and, of course, for inviting me here. Does it work? I don't. Yes? It's so. Okay. Not as a joke, but being from the old continent, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, which is, of course, instead it's due not to my old habits, but because it's not an explanation or an excuse. I'm now an administrator. It's very difficult to get time to do things. I told this before coming. What I will try to do is to discuss the use of anger in the Soviet Union. And of course I will do this way. First I will try to, problem with this? Like this? Okay. I will try to do this way. First I will try to summarize what we know now about what the Holodomor is, which is a relatively new knowledge. So it's very important to keep it in mind, because we have been confusing this for many, many decades, actually. Then I will very briefly touch upon the precedents, that is the use of anger in the 20th century. You already heard this morning about the use of anger during the Armenian genocide, but there is more to this. Then in the Soviet Union, basically during the Civil War. Then I will briefly comment on Stalin and the national questions, because in Ukraine you cannot understand the Holodomor if you do not grasp the importance of the nationality question in Ukraine. And I will finally deal with the context of the Holodomor and with the Holodomor proper. So it's good that we have now this new name, because for many decades we went on speaking of famines in the Soviet Union. Actually, we were speaking of many different things. We now know that there was a general context of suffering, starvation. Hundreds of thousand people died in many regions, different regions, over different period of times. And within this general context, there have been two particular episodes. Actually, there are another two that are not as bad, but there are other two. One is the Holodomor in Ukraine that started, by now I think we have a very good chronology. For many years I thought, many times, I thought, do we have a starting point? I will propose one. I think it's a reasonable starting point, which, by the way, is very tied to intentionality. And the Holodomor the real Holodomor begins at the end of November 1932, and if you want, ends in June 1933. So it's a very concentrated, and you have to understand that people started really to die in February, because if you take food for about 2-3 months, according to the places, the resources, you can go on. Then you start to die almost all together. So in between March, April, and June, about 3.5 million people died in very specific places. So the Holodomor is a very specific act in a very specific place, in a very specific time, with a mortality that I don't think has been matched from this point of view again. Because over a few months you have all these deaths out of hunger. Of course, the other question, the other big Famine was the Kazakh one, which had a completely different dynamic. The state, of course, was involved as well. Stalin's choices but was very different, and it took place about 1 year previously, in between 1931-32, and about 35% of the Kazakh population died. So in percentage, more than Ukraine, actually. Though the figure is lower, it's about 1.3, 1.5 million people. Then there are other specific famines, one in the Don, the other in the Volga region, in which hundreds of thousands of people died, over longer periods of time, though. So you have to understand that there is a general context with this very different phenomena taking place. And if you do not grasp this difference, it's very difficult to understand what the Holodomor was and to understand what Soviet history is also. As to precedents, the relevant precedents, I would say, of course, the use of hunger in war, the use of hunger against human beings is not new. This was the base of all, when people, the sieges and war of conquest, you destroyed crops, you starved population. This is absolutely normal. Actually, in the colonies of the European colonies, this was done, especially by the German, we know now. But in Europe proper, the use of hunger as a tool during wartime, not to mention peacetime, in the 19th, 20th century is relatively rare, I would say very rare, up to the World War I. Then, of course, you have World War I. You have heard already about the Armenian. But I do not want to compare absolutely these two phenomena. But if you think of the British strategy against the Central Empires, was one of encircling them and getting them by starvation. The idea was to block all the import of food. This was a formal strategy of the British empires against the Central Empires. So the use of hunger, of starvation, that is to conceive of the Central Empires as a besieged fortress, forcing them to have rations. So this, of course, was very old. There is nothing terrible. It's a normal, there is a lot of terrible, but it's not new or strange. Then you have, during World War I, a lot of cases of specific uses of hunger to suppress peasants' insurrection, people that are doing things you don't want them to do. And you have this especially in the Soviet Union, that is Russia, basically, and Ukraine, the post-Tsarist space, in which we know from Soviet sources that by now we have, that hunger was used as a way to subdue peasant revolts in 1918, 1919, 1920. Specifically, it was used and theorized. You can read that there are theories. They wrote about how to do this, how to employ hunger in suppressing the great peasant revolt, the Antonovshchina, in the Volga. This was specifically elaborated. We have to use hunger to do this. So specific regions were surrounded, all the food was taken out, and so on and so forth. So during the war, you have this conscious use of hunger. But then you can go a step further, and here I want to quote Lenin, because when in 1921-22, at the end of the Civil War, as you may know, a big famine that had, of course, various components. First of all, Lenin admitted the famine existence, help was asked also from America, from Europe. The famine had also a component that was caused by major requisition in 1920-21. So there was also a component that depended on the state action. Of course, war, the misery of war, was another component. But Lenin wrote this note that I want to read to you. He wrote this to Molotov on March 19, 1922, at the height of the famine. And he wrote, "It's precisely now, and only now, when in the regions where the famine is ravaging," I don't know, I'm translating from Russian, "and people eat human flesh, and hundreds, if not thousands of corpses lay in the streets, that we can, and therefore we must, carry on the confiscation of church holdings with the most savage and ruthless energy without stopping before any resistance. the party congress must organize a secret meeting on this problem of the use of famine, and we have to approve a secret resolution on of the Congress on the necessity, and then he continue, to use this period of hunger in which people are desperate to act politically. Why I'm saying this? Because you have here another use of the famine, no more as an instrument to quell a revolt, as it was normal, though the Bolsheviks did this on a very large scale, larger scale than elsewhere against the peasant in 1990, 1920 especially, also against Makhno, for example, in southern Ukraine. But because here you have a political use, although against religion, not against the peasantry. Why I'm quoting this? Because we now know that, of course, Lenin and Stalin relations was very contradictory, that they were very close. At the same time, there was a major fight between the two, but certainly, and Stalin said so up to the end, and I think this to be very true, he considered himself as a pupil of Lenin. And he actually always claimed that he studied Lenin in order to learn. And what he was learning here, this is of course my, but I'm saying that the basis is very strong. I will give you the quotation from Stalin, both in 33 and then in 52, is using, the lesson is you can use the famine not only to suppress peasants, but also to reach political ends. So this is what I want you to keep in mind. The other thing you need to keep in mind, of course I will be very brief, but I hope you will ask me questions. Stalin had a vision of the national problem that had very little to do with Marxism, traditional Marxism. This is true also of Lenin, but Stalin was the one that formulated it, though of course Lenin was the inspiration. If you read this very famous 1913 booklet, the vision is actually very, if I may say so, I hope, it's Herderian, not Marxist, in the sense that there are peoples, ethnic peoples, these ethnic peoples have specific languages, have a specific history, a specific culture, and so that it's not a total international affair, that is like Marx famously wrote in 1848. And in 1919, when in 1919 Bolsheviks were defeated in Ukraine by the largest insurrection of the Civil War, peasant insurrection against the Bolshevik regime. And Stalin was there, by the way. He was in Ukraine at that time, and Lenin and Trotsky too. This was the most important political defeat that the Bolsheviks suffered. And actually what happened was that the peasants' insurrection in Ukraine opened the way to the Nikin and the Whites and provoked the fall of the Bolshevik governments. They fled to Moscow, so it was a total catastrophe. Once this was over, in November, they started to think of the necessity, if you wanted to, to defend the revolution, the new power, to consolidate the new power, to give something to the nationality and to the peasantry. So in their mind, the two things were very combined. Because why did the Ukrainian peasants rebel so much against us? Lenin wrote, it's a very famous secret letter, because of the Russian and the Jews, that's what he said. I'm not saying this is right, but it's what he was selling to the party. Because the Russian and the Jewish population in the cities forced the Bolshevik government to be very much anti-Ukrainian, and you cannot have an anti-Ukrainian government in Ukraine. And so the national factor compounded the peasant social factor, and we ended up with a total failure. So we have to introduce measures to support the Ukrainian in Ukraine. These measures, as we all know, I cannot go on, were introduced formally in 23. Stalin defended them very much. And in the words of Jordania, the very famous Menshevik leaders from Georgia who lived in emigration, Jordania was totally struck by this. He said, Ukraine is being built before our own eyes by the Bolsheviks. This is 1925. And I'm quoting now from Stalin in 1925 to show you why this link between nationality and peasant at 1919 had really impressed on him, though it came from before. It's so important. It's a famous question. I always like to quote it. He said, the national question for, let's say, peasant peoples, what Hegel used to call the non-historical people, meaning the peoples of Eastern Europe, not the German, the Italian, the Poles, and the Magyars that were civilized historical people, but the Czech, the Slovene, the Ukrainian were not in Hegel, or even Marx and Engel's actually vision, historical peoples. He said the national question is for these people in essence a peasant question. Not an agrarian, but a peasant question, for there are two different things. It is quite true that the national question, Stalin likes to repeat himself, must not be identified with the peasant question, for in addition to peasant questions, the national question includes such questions as national culture, national status, etc. But it also, beyond doubt, pay attention, that after all, the peasant question is the basis, the quintessence of the national question. This is Herder, 100%, right? If you know Herder, that is. That explains the fact that the peasantry constitutes the main army of the national movement. The main army of the national movement, 1919. There is no powerful national movement without the peasant army, nor there can be, etc., etc. So this is what he's thinking in 25. They, of course, at this moment are giving things to both the peasants and the nationalities. But then, as you know, in 1929, they start what they call the new war against the peasantry, because they wanted to transform the Soviet Union into a socialist state. I cannot elaborate on this. It's very extravagant, because very serious, very, I would say, good-willing Ukrainian national communists opposed this drive for speed industrialization, with the hope that with speed industrialization, a major influx of Ukrainian peasants would come to Russify the cities in Ukraine and conquer the cities. So you read a lot of this stuff from Ukrainian national communist leaders saying, we have to go with Stalin, because if we do it speedily, the population of Kiev will change, and Kiev will become an Ukrainian city. Because at that moment, major Ukrainian cities were not inhabited by a majority of Ukrainians. So he launched this collectivization drive and the kulakization. And as you know, this is very interesting. At that point, not to repeat, and this was said openly, we cannot repeat the mistake of 1919, so we will not attack also on the national front. Ukrainizacja, meaning Ukrainization, the defense of Ukrainian language must continue, and we have to attack the peasants as peasants, not as Ukrainian peasants. Of course, he also unleashed an attack against high Ukrainian culture, but also against high Russian culture, so this doesn't change. And of course, this confrontation with the peasantry, though, became very tense, and already in the spring, let's say February, March 1930, there were revolts all over the Soviet Union. Professor Viola of this university studied that, but we know very well that the largest revolts were in Ukraine, precisely in the same region that had rebelled in 1919. This is very important to remember. And these rebellions forced Stalin to a retreat. He said, we cannot go on like this. We cannot take the land out of the peasants like this. Even we are not attacking them as Ukrainian. We are continuing with school in Ukrainian and so on and so forth. The confrontation against peasants cannot continue this way. What is interesting is that the Ukrainian National Communists started to have the first doubt at this point. You see this in letters like Skripnik. Skripnik was the most important Ukrainian National Communist, who wrote, we should not attack all the high Ukrainian intelligentsia. They are not all bad. And of course, Stalin said this was unthinkable, that the attack should continue. But they started to have problems with this policy. This is very important. The other fact that you have to keep in mind that in 1931, precisely at the moment after the retreat, there was a very good crop in 1930, and I thought that the battle against peasantry had been won. So at the beginning of 1931, they launched another major industrialization drive that is generally not spoken of, but you have to, it's very important, because this was financed through German loans. So they took on German loans that were to be repaid in 2 years. And this was a huge drive for industrialization that brought a huge influx of peasants in the cities, which meant, of course, that you had to feed the cities more than before, because if the population in the cities increase, you have to get more grain to feed, and you need more grain to export in Europe or in America in order to repay the German debts. They did this because they thought they'd won. If you read their correspondence at the beginning of 1931, it's very ebullient. They think we won. Then the harvest of 31 was a disaster. The procurement, that is, were very low. They were not enough to feed the cities, the new inhabitants, to export. They continued to export because they wanted to continue. But at this point, the war with the peasantry was over. Again, it started again. The requisition of late 31, beginning of 32 was a little war, not a little, but little compared to what it was in the Civil War, but was a big war. By the spring of 32, there were pockets of famine caused by requisitions in many places, but especially in the Ukrainian countryside. About 100,000 people died, we know now, more or less, maybe more. It is important because the Ukrainian National Communist leadership at this point, they toured the countryside and started to write openly the policy, Stalin made a wrong policy. This was a disaster. The 1929 choices were wrong. They didn't say it so openly as my Putin, but they said this very openly. The peasants, they said, are accusing formally the communists of these famines, of this requisition-caused famine. And so they started to ask Stalin to lower procurements and requisitions. This in June 32. At this point, though, the country was in a big crisis. This is the immediate context of the Holodomor, because there was very little to give the workers in the cities. In fact, you have major strikes in the spring of 32 in Russian cities. You had to export to repay the German loans and to continue. There was no money. They had to discontinue valuta payment to specialists that were building, the steel mill, the big tractor works. And this was very like what China had to do with Soviet specialists in 1960. They had to discontinue completely. And so all these people went away, left the Soviet Union. All these factories stopped. So in the summer of 32, there was a major, major crisis. And they started to doubt not only Stalin, but and not only the Ukrainian National Communists, but all the many, many leaders of the Communist Party that maybe the 1929 choices had been wrong. You had the very famous letter by Ryutin, not a very high, but a high cadre that called to tyrannicide, that is openly, and that this circulated in the party. In the party, you read what there is, and you are left with the impression of a party that is saying Stalin is wrong, we have to get rid of him. And Stalin, that got all this material from the GPU, we have, this is very good, that Stalin went on vacation in the summer, there was no reliable telephone, so he exchanged letters every day, and we have the letters. So it's a fantastic window of opportunity on 1932. And Stalin started to elaborate a theory clearly, I can be very brief, saying the country is in crisis. This is because of peasant resistance. The peasant resistance is particularly strong in Ukraine, where it's particularly strong because the Ukrainian National Communists are abetting the peasants. This is not a communist party, it's a party of traitors. They are agents of Petliura. So we have a crisis in the Soviet Union and a specific crisis in Ukraine due to the fact that the local communists are going with the peasants. And he expressed this in the famous phrase of the letter that we are going to lose Ukraine. There is a risk we lose Ukraine. But we have to transform it in a Bolshevik fortress. This letter, I think, is the beginning of when the Holodomor starts to be elaborated. It's not yet there. You have to understand that in June 32, Stalin, even if secretly, bought grain abroad in Iran to feed the peasants, answering the pressure from the leadership, from the Ukrainian, but also other leaders. So he knew what to do. He was buying, grain outside and bringing them to feed starving regions and so on and so forth. Slowly, with the crisis that was mounting, and you see this in September, there are desperate letters. And you remember that in November, Stalin's wife commits suicide on the anniversary of the revolution, for many reasons, also private, but also political. We know this. At this point, there is really a war for death and life. It's read this way. And Stalin uses the same tool that he used in the past. He sent his trusted advisor, Molotov, Kaganovich, Postishev, around. Then he gathered them in Moscow, precisely at the time when the wife commits suicide. And I would say from this moment, from the beginning of November through the beginning of December, the idea of the Holodomor crystallized. I think this is relatively new, but it may be well known, but not so much. And I think you can, if you want really the proof, at the Central Committee of the end of November, Stalin uses the word, we have to deliver a sakrushitelny udar, how to say it, a destroying strike, a totally crushing strike, a crushing strike against the peasantry, and especially the Ukrainian, because of all the reason I told you. And then on December 13, he reversed the policy of Ukrainization only in Ukraine. And he starts, why this is very important for today, because the policy of Russification, all the dictionaries were rewritten with words substituted with Russian words, or the orthography was changed. This I cannot talk of, but it's extremely interesting. So there was a double move, a crushing strike against the peasantry using hunger, and a strike against the national communists, the intellectuals, the fruits, if you want, of Ukrainization in the 20s. The orthography being maybe the best example of this, because they've been Skripnik had reformed the orthography, and now they went back to a Russianized, very Russianized version of Ukrainian script. So out of fear, I would say, in these 15 days, you had these two decisions, and you can follow this. I will not do, because this is more well known, and I have no time, but maybe if there are questions. The measure, I was very interested to hear about Ireland. Ireland is terrible, but this is, it's not a joke, but if there was more or less a sphere in Russia, in the Soviet Union, would have been much, much better. Because the measures are striking. First of all, you take the food. It's not that you do not help. You send special detachment to take everything that there is in peasants' houses. There is a very big difference from not giving or giving little and taking everything from. In some areas, entire regions were surrounded. They were put in what was called the blacklist, and all the goods, food, were taken out. But these were big regions with hundreds of thousands of people. And in 1933, at the beginning, mid-1933, peasants were prevented from moving out of famine-stricken areas. Again, the disaster of the ships going to America. But the Ukrainian, for example, the Ukrainian peasant that had reached the Caucasus, southern Transcaucasia, where there was not so much famine, Georgia, they were put back in the ships. They were, rounded up in big operations, put back on ships and shipped back to Ukraine by the thousands. So there was a very interventionist policy, and I don't know if I have still 5 more minutes. So okay, so I can tell. You have clearly the rationale behind this. I'm leaving out the national part, though it's very interesting. It's as you can understand now, it's very tight. But for example, in March, Kossior, that was a leader of the Ukrainian party, wrote clearly to Stalin that the hunger didn't yet teach the Ukrainian peasants the lesson we wanted to teach them. So this is a clear evidence. But Stalin writes this openly to there are polemics if he was really the author or not, but let's presume he was. The author, Sholokov, of the White Flows the Dawn, I think is the English translation, I'm not sure, but I read it in Russian. So anyway, Sholokov said, but peasants, Cossacks are dying of hunger. And Stalin replies, but they are dying because of their fault, because they waged the war against the state, and now we are teaching them a lesson to obey the state. So hunger is a tool to impress submission on the peasantry. And at this point, you see, why in the beginning of March, when Kossior is writing, hunger didn't yet teach peasants? Because as I told you, they started to really clean the countryside in December, because the decision is end of November, the anti-Ukrainian measure are December 13, then you must send the detachments out, and so on and so forth. You have to stop the peasants, to send them back to the countryside. So I would say that by February, hunger was there, but people could eat rats, foods, fish, whatever. By March, people started not to have food. By April, they were starving. We have now all the statistics I'm not giving, but really the concentration of death is impressive. And now I will just quote what the Italian ambassador wrote to Mussolini in 1933, in May, no, on July. And he wrote to Mussolini in July. Italy had many consulates in Ukraine. So actually, Italy knew very well, like Poland and Germany, what was happening. And Attolico was a very intelligent man. He was not a fascist. Actually, was kicked out because he opposed the alliance with Hitler and died soon afterward. He was a major diplomat from older time. Attolico wrote that, how to say, stopped in their villages, and for them it was made impossible to ask, the cities for help, absolutely deprived of any help. To the Ukrainian peasantry has not been left any choice but to work for the government to obtain the minimum of food or die literally of hunger. Here is the secret of the triumph of the Stalinist line. So the Italian ambassador understood this very good because he had reports. So from March through July, the starvation was really used, was very successful. And, the victory was celebrated, and I'm finishing with another small quotation that I also like to remind people of, was celebrated in January 34 because the Congress of January 34, which came after such a crisis, you remember 1.3 million deaths in Kazakhstan of hunger, nomads, 4 million, 4.5 maybe in Ukraine, hundreds of thousands in the Volga, in the Kuban, in the Northern Caucasus. So it's about 7 to 8, I would say, altogether, 1930 to 1933. This was called the Congress of Victors, officially. This was the name of the 17-party Congress, the Congress of Victors, which meant we had waged a war using hunger, and we won. And in 1952, and with this I leave you, maybe I just add a word on the question of genocide, though I have problem with it. Stalin received the Ukrainian Politburo delegation about procurements in Ukraine and told them, the history of mankind knows many tragic cases in which entire nations died out because of lack of bread and were thus cancelled from history. This is Stalin speaking in 1952. That is, it's not a proof that but certainly the way he was reasoning. So I have to confess that as a historian, I have many problems with the category of genocide because, of course, the category is a legal category. So for us historians, it's very complicated because it's very formal. It's linked to, judges, tribunals. History is very subtle, and it's very difficult to. But I would say that, of course, you have a very strong case to call it a genocide. You have intention, you have the use of a tool, you have results, you have actually an intelligent use, both of the anti-peasant and the anti-national. That is, I would claim that this is a much more, please forgive me the word, intelligent, sophisticated, let's put it intelligent, we reserve to good people. But let's say sophisticated, unfortunately bad people too are intelligent at times. It's a very sophisticated use of hunger that comes out of a tradition that started with the Civil War and is much elaborated upon by Stalin. And I think this is what distinguishes the Ukrainian Holodomor from all the other cases, which are many. And I think I'm very happy, and with this I finish, that we are here for the second year, trying to contextualize in the sense to compare, to introduce element of comparison with other tragedies, massacres, genocides, famines, because these allow us to single out differences, similarities, and I think we will end up, this is by now I'm totally convinced of it, that besides genocide, but together with genocide, we can speak of political famines in 20th century history for sure, as a particular variety of genocide. This is my complete conviction. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank both organizations for inviting me here today. I've been traveling around the United States and Europe talking about the crisis that I'm going to talk about today, the genocide by attrition in the Nuba Mountains. I'd like to ask if you would raise your hand. Yeah, I don't want it up yet, thanks. I'd like to ask if you would raise your hand if you are conversant in any way with the crisis that broke out in Darfur in Sudan in the early part of this century. Just raise your hand. Okay, a good number of you. Most of you. Now I'd like to ask you to raise your hand again if you are conversant with what is being referred to by many scholars as the genocide by attrition in the Nuba Mountains in Sudan. 3, 4? 4. 4 people. All right, well, it's not surprising. I'd say that I'm in the field of genocide studies, and I'd say that probably most folks in genocide studies, at least I'll say 10 years ago, were really not well informed about the case in the Nuba Mountains. So it's not surprising that, that more folks aren't familiar with it. I'm going to do 2 things today, and I've got a half an hour to do it, so this is going to be miraculous if I get through it. I'm going to talk about the genocide by attrition from '89 to the mid-90s in the Nuba Mountains. And then what I'm going to do is come up to June 2011 through today and talk about what's transpiring in the Nuba Mountains today under the very same regime that perpetrated this genocide by attrition in the 1990s. First of all, though, I'd like to put up a couple of maps just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, where I'm talking about. Thanks. Oh, yeah. Do you have the red? All right, so here we have Africa, continent of Africa. Here's Sudan. Very interesting to look at the countries that that border Sudan: Egypt, part of Libya, Chad, Somalia, and now you have also the Central African Republic. And Eritrea. There was a lot of violence going on in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in this particular area. And weapons were being flooded into Sudan at that time. And so rebel groups had ready access to a lot of weapons, very powerful weapons at the time. In fact, the saying is among scholars is that while there was little water, which is part and parcel of the problem early on, there was a flood of weapons, which contributed to the violence that transpired in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. When I was in the Nuba Mountains, I've been traveling to the Nuba Mountains for the past 5 years, including during this period of the war. And I heard that starvation now was also taking place in the Nuba Mountains during this period of time as a result of bombings by the government of Sudan. And as I traveled through the Nuba Mountains, I really didn't see what I thought starvation generally would look like. And what I mean is most of the people that I saw along the roads in villages, in compounds, were active. They got their work done. When I spoke to them, they seemed relatively healthy. Most did say that they did not have as much food as they wanted. And so I began to really wonder, what's the situation? Why are there so many scholars, particularly in the United States, claiming that we had another genocide here and there's another case of starvation? But it's interesting, I went up to see the only surgeon at the only hospital in the Nuba Mountains. And I'm going to show that map up here as well. Can we show the next one? So when I'm talking about the Nuba Mountains, it's in the state of southern Kordofan, right here, and the Nuba Mountains right there. Now, this is South Sudan, the newest country in the community of nations that was established in 2011. Okay, let's see the Nuba Mountains then. All right, so this gives you a better shot. So this is the new nation of the Republic of South Sudan. This is all of this is all of Sudan. This is southern Kordofan, and there's the Nuba Mountains. So there are about 1 million to 2 million people in the Nuba Mountains. There's one hospital, one surgeon, and his name's Tom Katina. And so I made a point of going up there and talking to him about the issue of hunger. And he said, let me put it this way. This is what's happening today. We have families who are bringing in children, little kids, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, who are so hungry that they're climbing trees to seek out food, fruit obviously. They're going up as high as they can and out on very thin branches. And he said, I can't tell you how many kids are falling out of those trees and injuring their arms so badly that the parents bring them in here. And he said, and this is what I have to do. I have no choice. In many cases, the breaks are so bad, the bones are crushed so badly, I have to amputate their arms. And he raised this question. And what do you think that means for their future and a society that is basically an agrarian society? So George Sherinian this morning brought up some key points about the aftermath of genocide. These people are I don't think it's a genocide today. I think it's a case of crimes against humanity, and I'm going to talk about that if I have time. But the fact is, these kids will be facing a life where they're 30, 40, 50, 60 years old with one arm or leg and expected to raise their own food, provide for their family. The last time I was in this hospital, which was in April, I saw 5 people, several without arms, several without legs, all as a result of shrapnel from the bombs that are being dropped on civilians today by the government of Sudan. Now, before I get into this talk, I always seem to have long introductions, I'm sorry. But before I get into this talk, let me ask you this. We've heard about 3 cases today where food was being used in various ways or denied in various ways. George Sherinian made an argument that food was being used as a specific weapon of genocide in Armenia. I think it's absolutely clear the tragedy that unfolded in the Ukraine and how food was being used there. We know that the same thing, not the same thing, but food was being used in Cambodia. That is the denial of food by the Khmer Rouge between 75 and 79. And my question is for all of you here, and maybe historians may not like this question, but this is for you to think about as human beings. What if you lived in 1915, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, or 32, 33 in Ukraine? What could you have done, if anything, in regard to this issue of starvation? And to put it another way, what would you have hoped you would have done? Now, maybe nothing, you'll say to yourself, or maybe I couldn't have done anything. But it's a question to ask yourself. And the reason I ask myself that is that, again, food is being used today as a weapon against people where they're being denied food, where people are suffering everything from malnutrition to severe malnutrition to starvation in the Nuba Mountains. So I'll come back to that. All right, so the genocide by attrition. Sudan's a complicated case, as any of these are, but in 1983, the Second Sudanese Civil War broke out between the South and the North. People in the South basically were arguing that we've been disenfranchised in just about every single way. They pay taxes, they have no bridges. They pay taxes, there are virtually no roads. They pay taxes, there wasn't even a hospital with a surgeon until 2008. They pay taxes, very few schools. And so they requested time and time again input into governmental decisions and asking for assistance from the government in Khartoum, and Khartoum basically ignored their request. And ultimately, the people of the South ended up fighting against the North, Khartoum. And that went on from 1983 to 2005. Now think about this, 1983 to 2005. 2 million people were killed during that period in this particular civil war. 2 million. Now the Nuba Mountains, the people in the Nuba Mountains, again, they're in the state of South Kordofan. They didn't end up joining this war effort, and they fought along the South until about 1989. And the reason that they didn't is because they didn't feel particularly encroached upon at that point in time, and they were trying to figure out ways to avoid fighting with the government. There had already been a civil war, first civil war, that was devastating to the country. But over time, herdsmen, referred to as Arabs by the black Africans in Sudan, and that's the way they refer to themselves, began to encroach upon their land, because in 85, there was a major drought in Sudan. In 1991, there was another drought. And as a result of these droughts, the people who were herders would come down and actually use the land of the farmers without asking permission. Their animals would destroy the farms, and when the black Africans would come out and speak to the Arabs, they would often be told, speak to the Kalash, meaning speak to the Kalashnikov. And violence began really in 85, 86, 87, 88, 89. And the same thing was happening in Darfur at this time as well. Also, at this particular time, the South, the soldiers in the South started, or the rebels in the South started going north in their fight, and they did begin to encroach upon the Nuba Mountains, and the people of the Nuba felt that they had no choice in regard to fighting or not, because the war was brought to their land. And they joined the South. Another reason why they joined the South is this, is that the government of Sudan had the intent to build what it referred to as, to establish mechanized farms in the Nuba Mountains. Their goal was to develop what they were referring to as the breadbasket of Sudan. To establish these farms, they took the land from the people and they forced people into what they referred to as peace camps. Peace camps was basically a euphemism for concentration camps. Mainly women and children ended up in these camps. The women were virtually used as concubine. And what I mean by that is the women were forced to marry the troops from the government of Sudan, and if they didn't marry them, then they were basically used as sexual beings whenever the soldiers wanted it. There were even cases where women were taken from South Kordofan and sent up to Khartoum to be used as basically, again, for sexual purposes. The children at this time, meaning the children of the people of the Nuba Mountains, were taken from these peace camps, put into fundamental Islamic schools, and were schooled in the philosophy of fundamentalists, and basically began to change the way they were thinking and alienating them from their families. The fighting at this time, there was ample fighting, but along with this taking over of the farm area, vast acreage, the government of Sudan came in and began bombing the region. And when I say bombing, it didn't only come in to bomb the rebel fighters, but it came in and began bombing the civilian compounds, the souks, the open markets, the churches, the mosques, etc. Also at the same time, Omar al-Bashir in 1989 carried out a coup d'etat, became the president of Sudan, and when the Nuba people began to fight along the south, Omar al-Bashir threatened to establish Sharia law throughout the region. Now what's interesting, if you may recall, in Darfur, almost all the people involved in that conflict are Muslim in Darfur. That's not the case in the Nuba Mountains. In the Nuba Mountains, there are Christians, they're Muslims, and they're animists. And when the moderate Muslims and the Christians heard that Sharia law was going to be established, they were both frightened and outraged. Another reason to join the effort to fight against Khartoum. But coming back to these bombings, so these bombings were being carried out by planes called Antonovs, which were basically cargo planes that had been purchased from Russia and Ukraine. And what the government of Sudan did is they basically retrofitted these cargo planes into bombers. And these planes bombed daily farms and villages from about 1991 through 1995 or later. And they targeted specifically the farms. And this is where we get into the whole issue of food. And when they targeted those farms, the people fled up into the Nuba Mountains. And in the Nuba Mountains, there's caves throughout these mountains. And the people would go up to these caves, and they would go into the caves and seek shelter there. The problem is, the mountains are solid rock. In most places, there's no way that they could grow food. They were fearful of coming down because there were troops on the ground. And when the troops came in to attack the villages, they would go into the villages and go into the tukels, the homes of the people, and they would burn either the tukels down or they would steal the food out of the stores, meaning big round jars where they kept their grain, or they would burn that grain. So there was virtually no food there, and most people were afraid to go down and get it because they thought they were going to be killed. So what they do? You have to eat. And when I'm talking about numbers going up into the Nuba Mountains, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people who have gone up into the Nuba Mountains at that particular time. Now, there are miles and miles and miles of these mountains. I mean, to get to a series, the last series of mountains that I can get to these days before I would run into the troops from Khartoum, it takes me about 16 hours. And all along the way, there are mountains where people can go up into the caves. In fact, today you'll actually see people in those caves. Some people will even have their cots up there. They never leave the caves. So there are 100,000 plus people in these caves at that time, 1990s to 1995. So where do they get their food? Well, some people were lucky enough to bring some of the grain with them, but that didn't last long. Some people did take up the challenge and go down and try to get back to their villages and retrieve any food that might still be there. That food didn't last long. So what they resorted to was this: eating leaves, grass, and roots. We're talking 5 years. Now, the really absurd thing about this is that the people began to have great difficulty finding leaves, roots, and grasses, because you've got 100,000 people up there, and so they kept going further and further and further, and it got finally to the point where the people were so desperate, and this is well documented, that people would actually begin to dig up roots that they knew were poisonous. They would pick leaves that they knew were poisonous. They would eat grasses that they knew might be poisonous. And when you talk to the people in the Nuba Mountains about that particular period of time and the way they existed was, I'll give you an example of the roots. They would dig these roots up. They knew they were poisonous. They would throw them in boiling water, let them boil for a half hour or more, pull the roots out, dump the water, fill up the pot again with water, boil the root again, and they did that for a third time. They would pull it out, they would put it out in the sun for a day or two, let it dry out. They would then pound it into granules, and then they would cook those granules with any sorghum that they might have had left, and they ate it. And they'll tell you over and over again that the only reason they were doing this, there was no nutrition in this, they were doing it to fill their stomachs. That's the only reason. In talking to these people, and I've conducted scores of interviews with these people over the past 5 years, person after person, in far reaches of the Nuba Mountains have told me virtually the same story. And that is mainly babies and the elderly were dying from eating these poisonous roots because their systems could not handle eating this stuff. And so mainly babies and the elderly were dying from that. But starvation was widespread. The exact numbers of how many died is not known today. Again, there were about 1.5 million people up there. The estimates go from tens of thousands to a high of about 100,000. Now, that's bad enough, and the government was doing this. They knew that when they bombed the farms, when they destroyed the stores of food, these people had no food. They went up into these mountains. They knew that they couldn't grow food in these mountains. They knew that they would have to resort to eating something up there to exist. And yet the bombing continued for 5 years. But there's one other issue that comes into play. During this war that I mentioned, the Second Sudanese Civil War, again that went from 83 to 2005, the people in the South were suffering greatly as well. They didn't have enough food. And so there were NGOs, non-governmental organizations, primarily in Italy and the United States, to put pressure on the United Nations to start trucking food in to the region. And ultimately, Operation Sudan Lifeline was established. That's great news, obviously. And basically what happened is that Operation Sudan Lifeline had an agreement with the government of Sudan that when these trucks were going up and delivering the food, the government of Sudan would hold off on the fighting and the bombing with this caveat. We'll agree to that as long as you do not allow the rebels to get their hands on this food. As soon as we find out that the rebels get their hands on this food, the deal is over. But it's even more complicated than this in regard to the issue of the Nuba Mountains. The government of Sudan said this: you can bring in all the food you want to the people in the south, but none of it is going to the Nuba Mountains. None. Nobody is allowed in the Nuba Mountains. Why? Because they had these gigantic, as I mentioned, peace camps, i.e. concentration camps, where women were used as concubine, where the children were being taken away from their children, where people in these peace camps did not have enough food. They didn't want people up there. They didn't want observers up there. And so for 5 years, nobody got up into the Nuba Mountains because Omar al-Bashir, the president, said nobody's up there. So now we have purposeful bombing of farms, destruction of food stores, and now purposeful prevention of allowing people in with food, no humanitarian aid. So this continued through '85, as I said. This issue started being brought up both in the U.S. Congress early on. There was a researcher from Oxford, Alex DeWall, who was working on his dissertation at the time. There was a filmmaker, Julie Flint, who was working in the area at the time, and they brought they were the primary individuals who brought this evidence up beginning in 1994-95 and began publishing about this, producing films about this, and bringing this to awareness of the international community. Slowly but surely, food was allowed into the Nuba Mountains, but not enough to provide ample food for everybody in the area. And so up through 2001, people were still suffering from a lack of adequate food. So I'm going to make a jump. In 2005, the international community with the government of Sudan and with the rebels came to an agreement called the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. And the Comprehensive Peace Agreement basically simply allowed the people of the South to hold a referendum to decide whether they were going to remain with Sudan, a so-called new Sudan that was more respectful of everybody's rights, or to go their own way and establish a new nation. 99+% voted in favor of establishing a new nation, but the Nuba Mountains was deemed to be a part of the North by Omar al-Bashir, and so when the people of the South established their own nation, the people in the Nuba Mountains in the state of South Kordofan got stuck and was forced to remain with and under the fist of the government of Sudan. And that's where they continue to be to this very day. And so in the from about 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, there were discussions in regard to establishing more rights for the Nuba, better representation in parliament, more infrastructure, bridges, schools, at least medical clinics, if not hospitals. But there was very little action, and the Nuba began to raise objections to being stuck under Omar al-Bashir's government and basically living the same life that they had lived in the 1980s and 1990s. Ultimately, the rebels went to war in June 2011, and that war continues through today. Now, this morning and this afternoon, we hear all these numbers. I mean, horrific numbers. You know, 1 million people dead, 1.5 million, on and on and on. It's another thing I can tell you, to see these people being killed, their arms sliced off, and I didn't bring pictures, photographs on purpose, but I can tell you this. I've been up there 3 or 4 times during these bombings. They now dig holes where, when these bombers come over every single day, the people jump in holes. And when these bombers come over and bomb, the shrapnel flies off. And basically, if it hits somebody, it turns them into something that approximates hamburger. It shears their heads off in some cases, their legs, their arms. I was up there in April, and they're using jets now, fighter jets. And I was going through a town called Hebron on my way to a place called Qualib. And about 15 minutes after we went through Hebron, a jet attacked. There were 3 kids in the street. They all ran for one of these holes. One kid didn't make it, and he was literally cut in half. I met an American who went to the boy's funeral, and he said the father had both halves of his kid to bury and put out in front of everybody. This is happening on a daily basis, One more example, because I think I've got to wrap up here. Let me get back to the issue of hunger. I was heading north and pulled into a souk, and I saw this Jeep, this was in April, racing across the desert, the sand, dirt flying, and it was an Army Jeep. Had a .50 caliber machine gun in the middle of the Jeep. It was all open. And when they pulled up, they had a boy in the back who had been gutted, and his leg was half torn off as a result of undetonated, an undetonated mine. And what the kid had done, he and his sister had walked 10 miles. He was 12, his sister was 14, 10 miles to an area comprised of mango trees because they didn't have enough food at home. They were climbing these trees. Long story short, this landmine went off. The soldiers brought him up. They were asking somebody to take him to a hospital. I said, we'd take him to a hospital because I had a Land Cruiser. We put him in the back with his sister and his a neighbor woman, and we raced 30 minutes to the closest hospital where the only surgeon is. He died 15 minutes before we got there. The only reason he was there was to get food. It's happening today. Now, I said that Operation Sudan Lifeline in the 1980s they were not allowed to go up into the Nuba Mountains. Today, nobody from the international community, no NGOs, no one is in the Nuba Mountains. The only way that you can get into the Nuba Mountains is to go in illegally across the border. So you don't have UNHCR, you don't have the World Food Program, you don't have USAID, nobody, you don't have Doctors Without Borders, you don't have Oxfam, nobody is in the Nuba Mountains while these people are facing the bombing and the constant hunger. I have a colleague who was there last year, and they were delivering food illegally going up into the Nuba Mountains. They came across 6 people, women and children, dead in a row 2 miles long, dead from starvation. This is going on today. So wrapping up, genocide by attrition, basically denying people food, water that they need for existence, and on top of that, purposely denying humanitarian aid to them to help them remain alive, is being referred to by scholars today as genocide by attrition. Now, I'm not saying that we have a genocide by attrition today in the Nuba Mountains, but it looks like it might be heading in that direction. Again, by the same regime, Omar al-Bashir, against the same people, the Nuba Mountains people. Thank you.
And now I'd like to call the discussant Joyce Apsel.
Hi. Can we take this off? Okay, thank you. I just want to say I was fortunate in that I have read both of the extensive papers that were part of the that the two talks were based on, and some of my comments and questions may have to address some of that. I'd like to begin by saying that when I teach my courses in human rights, and again, I'm thrilled to see there are some students here, that I always say to them at the beginning, you know, human rights is against the grain of history. And one of the important issues is seeing the crime. And in trying to pull together these case studies we've seen today, one of the things that we've seen is that at times the crime has been hidden. Sometimes it's hidden because of denial by the Armenian genocide. It's written out of history by the official Soviet history. But seeing the crime is an extremely important part of coming to terms with the crime. Sam Totten talked about the fact that very few people know about what's going on in the Nuba Mountains. And one question I have is, why such interest in Darfur? Why so little interest in the Nuba? And are not both cases related in some way to the government of Mr. Bashir? So maybe you could sort of pull those two things together. Amartya Sen, who famously observed in his book Poverty and Fairness, an essay on entitlement and deprivation and famine, starvation is the characteristic, he writes, of some people not having enough food to eat. It's not the characteristic of there being not enough food to eat. While the latter can be a cause of the former, it is but one of many possible causes. Whether and how starvation relates to food supply is a matter for factual investigation. And in all the case studies we've seen, we have understood that people not having enough food to eat was not simply a natural occurrence, but part of what I might call a kind of population politics. And this is another way of thinking about this. How do we change society? How do we transform society? And certainly, in the case of the Holodomor, in terms of the Soviet state, industrialization and modernization certainly played a very key role. Again, we're getting more and more written about the Chinese famine, and I know last year, I believe, you sponsored a conference on that, and what we see is, again, where do you see the crime? This was another enormous crime that was written out of the official history and is only being rewritten now. So one of the themes of, I think, all these cases is the historiography and the constant rewriting of history. And your paper, certainly, Professor Grazius, made very clear that this historiography of the Holodomor is being rewritten with new archives. What happened to the Kazakhs was largely ignored and largely unknown about. And one question I have for you is, in your paper, is a very important thesis about the impact on the eventual dissolution of the Soviet state that one might see a connection with in terms of the Holodomor. And I would like to ask you to at least speak briefly to that connection, because those of you who were here this morning remember that I talked about the spillover effect, that at the end of these atrocities at their height, they don't end, that they continue to have an enormous impact on the cultures and the societies, not only that have been targets, but also of the larger state itself. And so I think for the Soviet Union, the new archives that are opening up, that would be an important question. Another question that you referred to that I think would be interesting in terms of the Holodomor is the issue of linguicide, the killing of a language, and how that was attempted to some extent during the Holodomor, and or if not, is that correct? Yeah, in your talk, and could you just talk about the importance of language and how that was changed? Another very important feature that we've seen, historiography, seeing the crimes and actually understanding that they exist, and this is what Sam Totten's discussion was very much about, that the Nuba Mountains is simply an issue not really seen or comprehended. It hasn't really gotten a great deal of publicity. Why that's the case again? Why there is so little, and what it portends in terms of another feature we've seen. Sometimes, unfortunately, both atrocities, genocide, the use of starvation is successful. The Soviet state existed for a long time under Stalin. The Sudanese state, which is huge, exists and continues to be under the power of al-Bashir. The issue of the effectiveness of these strategies in not only causing harm, but also in terms of causing terror, in terms of resistance to the various levels of state control. Finally, I've got a lot here, and finally, one of the other issues that I think we've brought out in all of these cases, that hunger, scarcity are used to eviscerate, to weaken, they're part of a continuum that is used in what we might call either atrocity by attrition, or you use the term genocide by attrition, that again, these can be ongoing processes that take place and are taking place. And they're often, and famine is often accompanied with displacement and uprooting, and often with lack of health care, so that the impact of this on the peoples of the Ukraine, on the peoples of the Nuba Mountains, on the peoples walking in the caravans and death marches, the Armenians walking in the death marches and the caravans is ongoing. And I said this this morning, and I think it's really important to emphasize in such a conference, of what kind of harm, ongoing and physical, as well as emotional pain and stunting, are a result of this. There is a whole area of academics on the body, and of course, and the use of the body and the violation of the body. And of course, hunger is a violation of the integrity of a human being and their body. And so the terrible pain that is part of this is something that we have seen as present in all of these cases. We are left with understanding that under various guises, from the Great Leap Forward to the making of the modern Soviet state, to the making of a modern Turkey, the politics of destruction are often used as one of their many weapons, that of starvation and that of hunger. These are, in many respects, totalistic processes. Totalistics in the way in which they take over the human being and destroy them one by one. We can't forget that as we're assembled here today, and that the repercussions, the effects on populations are ongoing. Famine, the withholding of food, the right to food, which every country has signed on to, both in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the International Covenant of Civil, Economic, and Political Rights. That responsibility and right is inherent to the dignity of each human being. It is a great tragedy that we still struggle to achieve that. And all of the cases today really underline that we still have that challenge before us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Joyce. Would our presenters now like to say something?
Yes, thank you so much for the comments. I would start with rewriting history, which of course very complicated affair, but I think that in the Ukrainian case at least, but generally this is true for Europe, not from maybe other parts of the world, you have World War II that came right after the Holodomor or the Turkish, state building under the Young Turks first and then Ataturk. And World War II was such a major event that really precipitated a new vision of the world. And so when we rediscovered, because of course many victims continued to write about it, right? So I'm not denying it's not that we discovered it. It's like when Colombo came here, Indians were already in the States, right? The victims were always there and new. But when it was discovered by historians or intellectuals and they started to, let's say, trying to reframe European history, also in the light of these events, it was very difficult because World War II had created such a very strong framework, because it was such a huge, how to say, a change of everything. Yes. And so I think I was always very optimistic that in the end we would change this paradigm, the World War II paradigm. Yes. But it took actually a lot of years. But I think we are doing it, so I'm not pessimistic again, even today. As to feminist population politics, yes and no. Yes, clearly in the Ottoman Empire. My friend Eric Zürcher called the Ottoman, the Young Turks project and then the Ataturk project the greatest case of population politics, maybe in 20th century Europe. So clearly there. In the Soviet Union, I wouldn't call it population politics. It's national and social politics. Because Stalin was not thinking about population in the old rational, let's say, Enlightenment way. He was thinking of peoples, different peoples that you had to manipulate. And he believed that peoples were not eternal. From this point of view, he was not a nationalist, contrary to Mr. Putin or others today. Stalin had a very clear view that people could be manipulated, that they were historical objects, in a way. So you could, change their language. You could crush their intelligence. You could put them on a Russification course. So I think then it's it's not population in general. He was trying to operate with social and national elements and to manipulate them. So there is a slight difference, but it belongs to the same. As to the, this of course brings us directly to the linguicide, to effectiveness. I wouldn't call it linguicide. in the sense that it did not succeed completely, as if fortunately in the 60s there was already in the 60s, a big revival of Ukrainian language. But certainly it was very effective in the sense that the politics that was started then, all the dictionaries were removed. All the orthography was changed. All the words that are Western or Polish origins were substituted with words which had a Russian root. This was done systematically for 3 years. All the previous material that was published under the communist regime was removed, destroyed, that is taken out of the market. So there was a very, very thorough, again, people, let's say national, social, political, also because the other element was either you learn Russian or you do not progress in life. So you can keep your Ukrainian for your traditional, meal on Saturday or Sunday, but you don't want to talk it, to speak it at work. So it was effective. I would say that, of course, this we see even today in Ukraine, in the sense that from the point of view of the language spoken, there are still very large Russian. Of course, part of them come back from the Tsarist Empire, especially in the Donbass. But it was effective. But I would say that the most effective place, if you want to study effectiveness of these policies in the Soviet history, you have to look at Kazakhstan. Because the new Kazakh nation that was born out of this tragedy, you remember one third, maybe 40% of the population died. The nomadic way of life that had been traditional for centuries was completely eradicated. This did not happen. In Ukraine, there were still peasants after 34, 35. There were no more nomads, basically, in the Soviet Union. So I would say that the real study, if you want to study an effective tragedy, in the use of an effective tragedy, and all the Kazakh elite speak Russian to this very day, which is not so true in Ukraine. That is, some speak Russian, some do not, and depending on the moment who is in power. But there is a very strong Ukrainian speaking elite, which is not the case in Kazakhstan. So I would study that. And of course, the language policy would have been effective where the Soviet Union, if the Soviet Union was going to continue. And here I come to the final question, the impact of this on the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Because if you take all the data about Russification, mixed marriages, language spoken in cities, and so on and so forth, the Russification was very successful in a way, in spite of all the resistance. So the problem is that the Soviet Union, fortunately, if I may add the judgment, collapsed. And if I think there are two ways of linking, of course this was not the only reasons, but there are two important reasons for this that are tied to the Holodomor. And one was the fact that through the Holodomor, through the use of hunger as a tool, peasants were forced to accept collectivization. And we all know, and the Soviet knew already by 1946, 47, and Stalin knew it before dying, and Khrushchev knew it, and Gorbachev knew it, that collectivization didn't work. So the Soviet system had no legs to stand on. They could import, the collapse was delayed by the fact of by oil in the 70s, because they could import a lot of meat and grain. It was the greatest food importer in the world, the Soviet Union, in the 70s. But it was a country that could not feed itself, in spite of the vastity, the richness of the. So I think from this point of view, there is one reason. This was a country that was not self-sustaining, and on the long run, this was going to. And the second reason was a country, and with this I finish. This is very interesting, built on a lie, as you said. But this lie, it's very interesting, because if you take Khrushchev knew very well what happened in 32, during the war, in 46, 47. He actually wrote, I have my arms in blood up to the elbow, in his memoirs, openly. So up to his generation, they knew the truth about the Soviet Union. But slowly, the official discourse, that was everything was decent, there were some problems, difficulties, but this was, this official lie became something the very elite believed in. Gorbachev believed in if you read all the material, the Politburo meeting reports, Gorbachev, who lost, I understand, 3 uncles, if I'm not wrong, in the famine, did not know that there was such a famine in the Soviet past. Otherwise, he would not have admitted public discussion of the past. So in a way, this slide that penetrated also in the leadership, and they self-deluded, how to say, thought that this was good to discuss the Soviet past. It was a good idea. Instead, it was terrible, because as soon as you open the box and genocide comes out for the Kazakhs, for the Ukrainians, and the repression, and this is a past you cannot master.
This is very
So with this, so there are 2 ways. The system that could not work because of collectivization imposed on the peasantry, and this lie that was at the heart of the system. And the leadership of the 80s, Yeltsin, you know, was the son of a dekulakized peasant. Khrushchev lost these uncles in the famine in Northern Caucasus. And they couldn't, and they allowed to talk of these things. And I think, not to exaggerate, but Glasnost, that after 86, was a very effective agent in dissolving the Soviet Union, because you ended up discovering you were living in a country with no justifiable past. The only good thing was the war and victory, which is in fact the only thing they are now insisting upon and upon and upon. That's the only good thing they can think of, and even that is problematic.
I just want to add that following on this, as I read this paper, the series of works, the oral histories of the mass famine in China, and what the possible implications are that for the Chinese communist state, is something that we're going to have to wait to see. But your paper, you know, is filled with these kinds of issues because of the linking of what the Holodomor meant in terms of the dilution, not the only factor, but of a contributing factor to undermining its legitimacy. Thank you.
Okay, the question was why was there the focus on Darfur and not the Nuba Mountains? Can you hear me without this? No, okay. First of all, let's go back to the 1990s. I mean, there are a number of reasons why there wasn't a focus on the Nuba Mountains. First of all, that war went on from 83 to 2005, a very complex situation. Again, as I mentioned, 2 million people were killed. So there was a focus on that entire region, and the Nuba Mountains really is a tiny, tiny part of a large state. So not many people knew about the Nuba Mountains, and then on top of that, the area was closed off. Al-Bashir would not let people in, and so that compounded the problem. You didn't have journalists going up there. You did again have an intrepid scholar, Alex DeWall, who ended up reporting on what was happening, and an intrepid filmmaker, Julie Flint, making a film. They were about the only ones, along with other folks who were members of African rights, including people from Sudan, but it was a very small group. At the same time, we have to remember what was happening in 1990, the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia, the entire decade. We had a good part of the international community, certainly in Europe, the United States, Canada, and others, concerned about what was happening in the former Yugoslavia. 1994, the genocide in Rwanda, where between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed in 100 days, which absolutely devastated, after the fact, the international community. You had Srebrenica in 1995, 8,000 Muslim boys and men killed in Srebrenica, lined up pretty much the way the Einsatzgruppen lined Jews up and killed them, shot them, buried them. And so there was a focus on other major issues. Now, as we move into Darfur, this is very interesting. 2004, well, let's say December 2003, focus started to be directed at what was happening in Darfur. 2004, the 10th year commemoration of the Rwandan genocide. There were a lot of people in the international community that were saying, hey, look, we really failed in 2004. For years and years and years, we said never again, and then this erupts in Rwanda. You've got 500,000 to 1 million people who perish, and we failed. So there were a lot of people in the international community who, when they heard about Darfur, said, hey, it's a 10th year commemoration, let's act. And it wasn't that simple either. There were activists that were involved. There were, and I'll be very succinct about this, but it's interesting looking at the different actors who were involved who helped to focus attention on Darfur. There were a lot of evangelicals who were working in the area in Sudan. And when George W. Bush became president, they put a lot of pressure on him to act in regard to what was happening to those people who were being converted to Christians over the past decade and a half. So there was that attention. But there was also something else. There was a fellow named Roger Winter, who had been the director of the U.S. Refugee Committee for years and years, and was now a member, a official in USAID, and he started arguing in favor of doing something in regard to what was happening in Darfur, and he got the ear of people in the U.S. State Department, and ultimately was successful in bringing about an investigation by the Bush administration into what was happening in Darfur. There were many other many other issues that contributed to this attention as well. But the question is then, why the focus on Darfur, not Nuba Mountains today? I think that part and parcel of that is to use a term that or a phrase I don't like, but is bandied about a lot, is so-called genocide fatigue by anti-genocide activists. Now, what's very interesting is there was a lot of activist actions, very innovative, for about 4 years, 2004 to 2008, maybe 5 years, 2009. I don't know if a lot of people even realize this today, but a lot of the same sorts of atrocities are being perpetrated in Darfur this very day. The past 2 years, the government of Sudan has pretty much reactivated what it had been doing in Darfur. People are now being killed again. Their villages are being destroyed, and there are refugees moving out, they're individuals moving out away from their homes, fleeing, who are now IDPs and refugees. Nobody's doing anything about it. I think that there's also the problem that you have still about 2 million IDPs, individually displaced peoples who are living in Sudan, and you've got about 300,000+ refugees in Chad, and nobody's doing anything about that. The refugee camps in Chad are now towns. A lot of the tents that they had, I'll give you an example. I was in a camp of 13,000 people in 2004. They had brand new tents, row after row after row of tents. When I went back in 2010, there were no tents. There was virtually a small community, and the people are absolutely distraught that they're not going to make it back at home. They're angry about that. There are no secondary schools. I don't think the international community wants to deal with that. Finally, the word out, I don't have evidence of this, but I hear it all the time. There seems to be a quid pro quo between the United States now and al-Bashir, and what I mean by that is this, is that the word out is that the United States government has very tiny drone bases throughout Sudan. Now, I've met people who've told me that they've actually seen one of these bases just across the border from South Kordofan in North Kordofan. And it's the sense of a lot of people that al-Bashir is allowing the United States to establish these bases, basically not to raise huge problems at the UN Security Council, in regard to what's happening both in Darfur today, in the Nuba Mountains, and there's war going on in an adjacent area as well, the Blue Nile state. So all of those things come together.
Thank you. We're ready to open the floor to questions now. And before you begin, if you could identify yourself and try to keep your comments as short as possible and focus on the question. We'll take the first three. 1, 2, and 3. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the first question is a question to Dr. Graciosi about methodology. Harry Armstrong, I'm with History Department here and also at Glendon College. Since the fall of the USSR, the German government was funding a lot of research into German-Russian relations, but since that time the German government, I understand, has defunded, has stopped funding studies into the Soviet Union because, you know, we reached the apogee of progress, you know, with respect to the Soviet Union. So how is this study going to be continued when there are scholars that are interested but there's no funding? The other question for both of you is to look at this issue in relation to commodities. I mean, the question of South Sudan is dominated to some extent by oil, and we could look at this other situation here, the question of grain or even arms as commodities as well. But if you look at that through a different kind of lens, different perspective, the disposition of commodities.
Yeah, this is just a follow-up on the fall of the Soviet Union. And I think in one way, well, Kuchma, former president of Ukraine, wrote the book, Ukraine is Not Russia. And we have to always keep asking why. And one of the, Holodomor at least, is part of this. And I think to a considerable degree, we can argue the de-Sovietization went more quickly in Ukraine because it overturned the accepted Soviet norms of who should have knowledge and who should know the past. And it did so particularly because if the Soviet Union assumed that the imperial capital knows everything, the elite of the empire is the one who knows things, Mr. Gorbachev may not have fully known from his family, but many peasants still in Ukraine knew from their family and from their grandmothers that the Holodomor had existed. Or many urban, young, up-and-coming people in the Soviet Union were shocked to find out that when they went back to ancestral villages, that peasants knew something they didn't know. And we have seen this because REC is now going to publish, and is putting online now, a whole series of letters written in 1989 when an activist, Volodymyr Manyak, put in the newspaper, the Village News, a call for people to write in their experiences. And there were thousands, responses to this. And you can picture in the Soviet Union what that meant on that day, that suddenly these people from godforsaken villages looked down upon by the entire Soviet elite, suddenly their opinion or experience or the related experience of their was worthwhile. And so I think in that way, I don't want to overestimate the Holodomor as one of these issues, but it was one issue. And in Western Ukraine, where the memory was sooner, it was in a way the same thing. They would come from cities and suddenly find out that in villages people could recount everything that happened in the late 40s and early 50s in a certain way. So it did in a certain way change things, and is one of, I think, the aspects of why Ukraine develops differently than Russia.
My question is a little bit similar to Holosnisha? Oh, Valentina Kureliu, Director of Education at HREC. My question is related partly to what Frank Sisson was saying. This morning we discussed the impact of the Irish famine on the Irish independence movement. My question is to Professor Graziosi, to what extent do you think that the knowledge about the Holodomor in Ukraine, as Frank Sisson mentioned, since its independence, has been influential in what is happening in Ukraine today in their fight for their territorial integrity and independence against Russian aggression?
Okay, I'll make it fast. The question was about commodities. You know, another thing before I answer that, of course, in regard to the Nuba Mountains today, I mean, you think about the conflicts that we have in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Central African Republic, Somalia, all very violent. I mean, the international community's hands are really overwhelmed with problems. So I can see a tiny little place like the Nuba Mountains being overlooked in one regard. But to this question, yeah, there is oil in, particularly in Abyei, along the border of South Kordofan, Sudan and South Sudan. The problem is between Sudan and South Sudan. They're working that out. But of course, then there's the civil war in South Sudan as well that's just ripping that country apart. Massacres almost daily, at least there were the past year and a half. But as far as the weapons, yeah, I mean, China has a huge weapons deal with Sudan, so it's of course not going to vote in favor of an intervention or something along that line because it's got the veto at the UN Security Council, and as you know, one veto among the P5, Great Britain, France, China, Russia, and the United States, one veto, and any resolution is dead. And the Russians also have a large weapons deals with Sudan as well, and China is pumping a lot of oil out of Sudan when the pipeline's working. I mean, what's happening right now, of course, is when South Sudan controls the oil, but the pipeline can be shut down as well. So there's this conflict between the two, but I don't think that's having much of a bearing on the situation in the Nuba Mountains. I mean, I think in Darfur possibly, but that's just part and parcel of this entire situation. I think really what the government of Sudan is worried about is it's already given up almost half of its land to South Sudan. And I think that it fears that if the Nuba people then start talking about seceding, they're going to have then the Blue Nile state seceding, and it's going to continue, and they're going to end up with a sliver that they're controlling, meaning the government of Sudan. And in the government's mind, and that is al-Bashir regime, they're simply not about to agree to anything that is going to result in losing more land, and so they're going to do anything to control those rebels. The rebels, though, have told me over and over again, their plan is this, nice and simple. They're going to go to Khartoum and overthrow al-Bashir. Now, 2 days ago, they signed a peace agreement, meaning the government of Sudan and the Nuba Mountains. The very next day, the government of Sudan went in and bombed several villages and killed a good number of people. So that's the way peace agreements are not heeded or honored. And that's happened over and over and over again in Darfur. And now I think we're going to see it in regard to the Nuba and Blue Nile state.
First of all, let me tell you that as much as I know, and I know much because in the 1990s, German money was not important at all for research in Soviet history. There must have been somebody, but was not an important. French money, for example, was more important and was very little. There was Italian money, some American money. But if you think, for example, the volumes by Danilov, the secret OGPU reports that were published. This was French money. This was not some Italian money too I gave, but so German money was, and actually you don't have major publication in German about Soviet history. This was not, see, there were some good scholars, but nothing of great value. So we never missed this. Actually, also you have to remember that in the 1990s, to do research in Russia was very cheap. Up to 1997, 98, with the crisis. It's only after 2000 that prices became very steep. But I remember having, I don't want to bother you with this, but I rented an apartment with a friend the whole year through in Moscow for 10 years, paying a few $100s. That is. So it was never an issue of money. And most of the publications were done in Russian, for example, with the help of state government, of Russian government money. The Russian funds under Yeltsin, they gave little money, but to publish a book costed $3,000. The collection, Dokumenty Sovietской Истории, we published 18 volumes. I found the money was very easily found. It was very little money. So you gave fellowship to researchers for $300 a month, and it seemed a huge amount of money to them. So really was another situation, just to remember a period that was very exciting. And I will just say one thing about commodities, because it touches something she said. That, because of course grain was the most important commodity in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. But I ask myself, is a place where grain is the most important commodity a modern place? Because generally, when you think of modernity, you think you are beyond the need of grain. You don't think about problems of grain. I think actually when I try to conceptualize Soviet history, I think of Soviet history in the 30s as an ancien regime country with a despot, a war against the peasantry, famine, the use of torture, forced labor. That is, to me, to use this modern metaphor for the Soviet Union of the 30s, it's true they were building modern industry and the modern army, but to use it for the masses of people living there in the Kolkhozy. You know, in the 80s in Kazakhstan, I would say 90% of villages did not have running water. It's like Darfur. That is, we have to pay a lot of attention to this modern business when you think about the Soviet Union. It became more modern in the 50s with Khrushchev, then with Brezhnev, its own kind of modernity. But again, if you think of the role of personal connections, svyazi, as they say, this is not a modern society working on svyazi. That is, if you need something, you have to give something personal to make favors. This is not the idea of, at least as Weber defined the modern society, is the opposite. So just to raise the question of what modernity in the Soviet Union, that is, yes and no. Yes, yes and no. Yes and no, but not to deny that there were modern elements and that they grew, but one has to pay a lot of attention. The rest is of course very complicated. If you ask me, of course everybody has his own opinion. If you ask me, was the national factor a real issue in the fall of the Soviet Union? Let's say in preparing, I would say no. I would say that the Soviet Union collapsed because its own elite in 1985, 95% of its own elite decided that the system was not working. They didn't know what to do with it, but they started to, to destroy it themselves. To undermine themselves. They thought that if they undermined it, they cleaned it, something good was going to come out. If you read all the rhetorics 1985, there was no national, but for the Baltics after 1987, but Western Ukraine is like the Baltics. So the territories annexed and they didn't go through the 30s, of course, was a different story. I think it was very different. But Georgia too, yeah. Yeah, but yes, but also this late 87. What I'm saying is that the Soviet Union started to collapse because its own elite saw that the system wasn't working and they didn't know what to do with it, and also because they have no knowledge of it, because under Brezhnev it was forbidden to study the system, as you know. So they didn't have any knowledge of the system. If you read the books they were reading is really something you can laugh about. They were completely ignorant. of course, when they started to destroy the system, and especially after Chernobyl and Glasnost, and the past came about, then the national question from the Baltic, the next territories, Georgia, become extremely relevant, and that played a crucial role in the final collapse. This is my point. But it was not started from this. And for Valentina, so yes, after not only 1991, I think Holodomor, the very word is about 1989, something like this. That is, as soon as, I think in 1989, for the first time, they started to speak about the famine openly in Ukraine. Before then, it was forbidden. Yes, the fact that the Ukrainian, especially because of Western Ukraine, of the diaspora that played a huge role, of the fact that they were looking for a legitimization, and Kuchma played a huge role for sure. I think the fact that they had the Holodomor to rely upon was very important. And the fact that in the countryside there were still peasants, even though, 7,000 is a lot, but was not published, right, this collection. So I would say that it became crucial, and Valentina is very right, after 1991. Extremely crucial, also because Ukraine chose victimization, if you want, to be a victim of Russia, of Holodomor, of Stalin, as a national legitimization ideology. I'm very crude now, but it was one of the main. No, I like this very much. And also, they abandoned, if you want, ethnic nationalism too. They started to recognize, the Crimean Tatars. So it opened up with a lot of, there was a big change in the national discourse. They were able, at crucial times, to were able to reframe the discourse about your own nation. Yeah. In Italian history, it happened 3-4 times in the past 200 years. And so Ukraine went through this. And Russia, instead, for 10 years, was left without any national discourse. You remember when Yeltsin, but this I find very extremely interesting. I remember watching this. Yeltsin, first they tried with, you remember, with Stolypin. I remember, and nobody knew about Stolypin in Russia. So then they tried with Pyotr Первый, and they built this huge, horrible monument in Moscow. But even Peter the Great, nobody knew it. They tried with Orthodox religion. They tried with they were deprived of a, and the thing that came out at the end was victory, war. And this was Brezhnev, was not the Soviet Union. This was Brezhnev that allowed again the celebration of victory in '65. It was forbidden under Stalin and Khrushchev, because victory was a tricky thing. The war was not an easy topic. So I think that Russia started to find its bearing as a political discourse of legitimization in the late 90s with Putin, basically, beginning of, and of course, since it is victory over other people and war and self-affirmation, and victory means you are the big one who won. You're not the one that has been repressed. They started to develop a very, in my view, of course, this is moral judgment, a very bad form of nationalism, because if I build on victory over other people, this is not good.
It's an exclusive.
So this is just my, it is a very bad to rebuild a national. There are many ways of rebuilding a nation.
You're saying it's an exclusivist,
yes,
hegemonic.
Yes,
narrative.
precisely,
Yeah.
based on force and on being more powerful than the others. And of course, this too was, it took 10 years to decide to them, so it was not easy for them. I'm not saying, it was not that Russia was there, they were ready to, not at all. For 10 years, they didn't know what to do with their past. So one has to remember this. Maybe also Russia will choose another road, will take another road in the future. That's my point.
Okay, we still have time for more questions. We'll take 3, and it's 1, 2, and 3.
My name is Yuri Darevich. I'd like to welcome all of our speakers. Can you hear me?
Now I can.
Okay. I have a few questions for each of you, but of course, in order not to be accused of provoking a mini course, I will only ask one question of each of you, if I may. Firstly, to Professor Graziosi. You published and you spoke very well about the documentation that the Italian government received from their representatives, the consular staff in Ukraine. But Poland, Germany, France, England, the United States, in addition to Italy, also had a tremendous amount of information. And yet not one of these states ever at the time made these documents public or did anything about it. Would you care to comment why? Now, the second question is to Professor Samuel Totten. It's really more along the lines of an elementary question, but could you tell us a little bit about the Nuba region? Who are these people? How many of them are there? What is there? Is religion? Does religion play any, any role in this conflict? And also, the Nuba Mountains seem to be quite a bit away from southern Sudan. Do they consider themselves part of South Sudan, or what is why them? It seems like an insignificant piece of property.
Okay.
And then lastly, to the one each, to Madame Apsel.
Oh.
And it has to do with, of all things, the United Nations. We always hear this thing, we have to learn from history so things don't get repeated again. But in the case of the genocides, there's a genocide convention, there's regulations at the UN. It seems to have absolutely no effect about what's going on in the world. I mean, we are, many of them are speaking of the Armenian and the Ukrainian genocides, but since that time, there's been many more. Could you care to comment, what is the meaning of all these international conventions if one cannot use them for any purpose?
Okay, we're running out of time, and please keep your comments or your questions very, very short, and the answers as well.
Can I just keep seating? Yes, DC Ramses. I've been working on international conflict for decades. I'm now unwell and forced to retire. Just two simple points. You cannot divorce what's happening in the southern half of Sudan from the war against Christian Africa. I'm a Christian conservative myself. In 21 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, there is violence against Christians. In case of the Sudan, of course, the other can be non-Arab, as it's in the Darfur, partially Arabized, all true, but there is a war against the sub-Saharan component of Christendom. And just to go briefly in Eastern Europe, again, it cannot be divorced from the war against the Christians from the British Isles to Eastern Russia during the age of anti-Christian modernity. The Jacobins started, they killed 1 of every 12 Catholic Christians in the country of France. The casualties ending with the death of Stalin are 108 million. 70% Slavic Christians were destroyed. Same thing with the Armenians. All the Christians under Turkish occupation were attacked. And to conclude, this anti-Christian modernity continues today in the left-wing parties, including the Democratic Party in the United States. As for the international community that was referred to several times, it's a fiction, really. There's a few thousand people deciding. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Olga Bertelson, Columbia University. I have two questions, brief questions. The first one is for Professor Graziosi. You explained quite wonderfully the continuities in Soviet policies that go back to, 1990, right? And at the same time, you talked about Stalin, and you mentioned that the idea of the Holodomor crystallized in December 1932, or November, December. Do you think that we can identify, there is a clear line, can we identify some kind of period when this idea was crystallized in light of these continuities? And the second question is for Professor Totten. You mentioned that this 100,000 people resorted to all kinds of survival. They ate roots, right, leaves and grasses. Do you know if there are cases of cannibalism there? Because I just, it's my study and I'm wondering about this. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, let me take the Christian point. I did mention that evangelicals have been in the Nuba Mountains for years. They've been establishing churches, hospitals, proselytizing, and in the Nuba Mountains, unlike Darfur, as I mentioned, in Darfur you primarily have Muslims. In Nuba you have Muslims, fundamentalists, moderates, you have Christians, and you have animists, and you have Muslims who practice animism still, and the same with Christians. You've got quite a mix, but for the most part, there was real harmony between these groups. There was not a conflict. In fact, I'll give you a classic example. My first interpreter in the Nuba Mountains, his father is Muslim. He has 2 wives. One's Christian, one's Muslim. The interpreter's name, my interpreter's name is Ramadan. And when he ended up going to school, he ended up in a refugee camp called Kakuma in Kenya, and then ended up going to high school in a regular high school outside of the refugee camp. He began to reside with some Christians, and he decided to convert, and just last year he decided, well, Ramadan's not a good name for a Christian, and so now he's called Alexander. And when we were up in the Nuba Mountains, he went home for the first time in 10 years. He'd been away, and he had to introduce himself as Alexander and explain why. No problem at all. So that's one. Number two, as far as the Nuba people, I mean, there are about 50 plus tribal groups in the Nuba Mountains, a real mix of people. 50 plus tribal languages. Generally, most people speak Arabic. Very few speak English. It's a country of about, I mean, a region of about 30,000 square miles. And the other point is that in regard to why the Nuba Mountains, I think I touched on that. I mean, one is the area was ripe for establishing these mechanized farms, so they basically started stealing the land of the Nuba. That would outrage anybody when you live in an agrarian society. So that's one. Two, now that the South has established its own nation, the Republic of South Sudan, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the government of Sudan, al-Bashir, just is not going to countenance another part of the country to be lopped off, because they figure it could be the beginning of the end, because then the new Blue Nile, and then the question is, what's next? So we'll see. I mean, as I mentioned, the Nuba are intent on overthrowing al-Bashir. When I speak to the rebels about, well, what then, especially when you have all of these different tribal groups, different perspectives in Sudan, they said, well, we're going to establish a nation that's fair for everyone. And when I say, well, look at South Sudan and the disaster that's there, they said, well, we'll be different. So time will tell. I don't think it bodes really well for anyone.
Yes. To be brief, the question of who knew what is extremely interesting. If you speak of state, only Italy, Germany, and Poland really knew. The United States had no relations with the Soviet Union, no consulates, no network. The French had no serious network. The big networks of consulate were the Italian, the Polish, and the German. The Germans were the one who knew most. Then the Italian and the Poles. British very little. No consulate. The consulate in Kiev were the Italian, the French, the Italian, the Polish, and the German. So this was the real important network. Yeah, but the embassy was, you needed people, and the Germans also had collective farms, not collective, had big farms, concessions as they were called. So the Germans were the one that had the most important information. No one of these three states published anything, not even fascist Italy. No one published anything. So the states knew but didn't want to publish for many reasons, because of politics, of loans, of strategic reasons, of raison d'etat. I cannot answer in 3 seconds. It's very interesting. Of course, lots of people knew. Lots of people in Poland, in Romania, people knew in Germany, the Mennonite communities in Canada and the United States, the Jewish community from Ukraine in the United States and Canada, because also the Soviet states allowed suffering people to ask for help because they wanted currency. So these people were allowed to receive requests for sending money drafts that people could use in Ukraine to buy food in special store, where you could buy food only with dollars or pounds. So I think that if you touch this, you end up with a huge mass of people knowing something, but not the states. And the United States, I would say, especially the United States elite, was really the blindest possible elite. That is, they didn't know almost anything. If you take Roosevelt, these people, they didn't know anything. It's very impressive. That is. Mussolini, the German people, the Polish elite, they knew very well. So I would make this distinction. And then the population, which is different. As to the Christians, of course, in the Soviet Union too, there was a huge, these two are one of the many paradoxes of Russian ideology today, because of Stalin, of course, was, he destroyed more priests and bishops than any possible person in Russian history. One has always to remember that Orthodox priests, Russian Orthodox priests, were the single most targeted category in Russia in the 1930s. About 85% of them were killed. So the Russian Orthodox Church by the end of the 30s did not exist. It was recreated under Stalin. And this explains also the contradiction of this church. It is a very interesting story I cannot develop, but and also you all know that there were in the Soviet Union many more Orthodox churches in Ukraine than in Russia, because how to say, Orthodoxization, I don't know how to call it, had been much more developed in Russia than in Ukraine, which is a great paradox if you think of the Russian official ideology today. So that's why for the Russian Orthodox Church, Ukraine is so important, because it's where the great majority of their parishes were up until 1991. I don't know the situation how it evolved. I have to confess I'm a Soviet historian. So the Christian issue is a very important issue in Russia, in Soviet history as well. As to when the Holodomor idea Holodomor, he didn't think, of course, but I would say that now, for many years, I was, let's say, not certain. I would say now that it crystallized clearly in November, and by the end of that month, the decision was taken. Because really you have these two that I mentioned, these two decisions to deliver this crushing blow to the peasants, and on the other hand to turn upside down the Ukrainization policies. And in the following months you have the mass starvation in Ukraine and the suicide of Skripnik, of Kvilovy, and all the other, the mass firing and the destruction of thousands of Ukrainian intellectuals and functionaries of the Ministry of Education, the Commissariat of Education. So I think that the final decision was taken in between the beginning of November and the end of November, and also because up until October, Stalin was going through a real crisis, because I remember for him that the suicide of the wife was, I do not want to be a psychoanalyst, but was a very important fact in his life. He always lived afterward with a big picture of his wife, and he always tried to reach the people that had given her the revolver. This was a big issue. So this was a man that was let's say, from the spring of 32 through the October of 32, he was not so sure he could control the country. This is my, not impression, I would say I'm rather convinced. And then they took this decision and they won a war. And then they said, we won a war. So these two, it's very, that is combines very well. That is, I declared the war, I won the war. The final question, no, there is no final question, so I'm very happy to finish.
Let me, I forgot one. No, as far as I know, there was no situation where people were resorting to cannibalism. It's a very interesting question, but among the people that I've interviewed, nobody said anything about that. I did speak to my interpreter, mainly because of the oral histories I had read that the U.S. Commission on Ukraine Family put out. So I was curious about that, particularly in light of the fact that this situation went on for at least 6 years in Nuba Mountains. And but that's something I think that is worth pursuing, without a doubt, speaking to other people about it.
If I may add a line on this, you have to distinguish very carefully between, because cannibalism is not one thing. You are eating of corpses. It was very widespread. In 1922, 21, 22, 32, 33, which is trudo, bufoyet. Not necrophilia, you are eating the corpses because you
Necrophage.
yes. And then you have real cannibalism when you kill somebody in order to eat it. And I always thought that this would be a fantastic dissertation because there were cases in 32, 33 for cannibalism in Ukraine. So, and I think in China too, I've been told that the majority is eating corpses, not killing in order to eat. This too was there.
Chang's book on the Great Chinese Famine, over and over again, repeats the use of what you're describing.
But the American too in 91, 21, 22 said so.
I think I'm forced to end the session because we're running out of time, or we have run out of time already. I'd like to thank the two presenters, Professor Totten and Professor Graziosi, and also our discussant, Professor Apsel. And thank you, everyone, for your participation.